Okay, we are recording. So we are at happy hour, which is the craft office hours with me, and I'm Eileen Cook. And I'm excited to have you here, Vig, coming all the way in from Cairo to talk about actually memoir. And what I want people to know is one thing that worked pretty well is you sent me some questions ahead of time on River, which was quite nice because I did some homework before we met and had some time to think about it. So I have some thoughts, and so we'll go through some of those. And then if you have other questions, then you just chime in and let me know. Does that sound good?
Yeah.
All right.
Great to be here.
Thank you. By Jove, we've got a system that works. All right, so the first thing that you asked me, which was how to structure a memoir to work in both voices, one where we were and one we are today. And I thought it was a really interesting question, in part because it's a fundamental question that comes up in fiction as well, which is, what is the point of view? And you see that in everything. So certainly the one that comes to mind when I'm teaching, I often talk about, there was The Wizard of Oz, and then the author, I think it was Geoffrey Maguire, switched it around and wrote Wicked, which is the same story from the Wicked Witch's point of view, which was rather intriguing. So hang on, I have a message coming in from Crystal. No, it's not about this. I was hoping she could fix our technical questions, but she cannot. So talking about point of view. So the first question that I have for you to think about is, what's the purpose of each of the point of view? So is there something that you can only tell in one voice versus another? So with memoir, you have the option. I don't know if you've read any of the My Great Escape memoirs. They're by Laura Bradbury, and it's about her time in France. So she starts when she's a student and goes through renovating houses while living in France and being an expat and falling in love. And they're wonderful memoirs about growing up there. But she keeps the memoir firmly seated at that choice in the past. So she is writing it without the insight of who she is now. She's writing it almost as if it was her writing it at that time. You certainly see a lot more memoirs which are the opposite, which are people writing with, here I am at this point in my life, and I am now reflecting back on what happened and seeing it through that lens. Mm-hmm. So certainly if you're writing about who you were at that time, there's an immediacy to that, and it allows you to sort of show any confusion or pain that you've now since sorted out. So at this point, you may be like, now I get that. I understand what's going on. I did not get that at an earlier time. So the first thing that I would be asking you is, what is the purpose of going back and forth? What do you feel that you gain by doing that? What are the advantages of doing that? And what are the disadvantages of doing that? Because you certainly don't have to. You can choose one or the other. Certainly, ultimately, probably the most common way that I saw when I was looking through different memoirs was the fact that people did that in some kind of rotating chapter point. So they would have a chapter, for example, from the past, or maybe even 2 or 3 chapters from the past, and then some sort of introspective chapter with themselves now. I've also saw it, though not as common, done in 2 chunks. So for example, part 1 of the memoir is the past, part 2 of the memoir is present, and then there was kind of a small part 3, which is sort of explaining or bridging those 2 and how they work together. So those were the ones that I saw. My big question here is, have you tried writing some in both points of view?
Yes, I've just started writing it. I've started writing some of it just very recently in the point of view from where I am now.
Yeah.
Because obviously what I noticed, because the story kind of not that the book will start this way, but chronologically the story starts from where I am about 4 or 5. And I think what comes through that story is that the silence that is going on around the child, which then is explained later on in her behavior. You know, the fact that, children were supposed to be seen, not heard. You know,
Yes.
you're not supposed to have an opinion. You've no reason to ask any questions. So it's how she becomes very silent as a child,
Yeah.
and then, you know, finding the voice. And it's interesting as well because it is quite a lot about the voice.
Mm-hmm.
You know, finally starting to find her voice. You know, years, but yeah. So I think it would be really interesting to try and do it, because the small child looks at her mother completely differently than what I would do if I retrospectively look at the mother, because then now I understand I did
Yes.
back then.
Yeah. And I would say there's a big part of that comes with, obviously in memoir, but certainly just in adulting or with growing up, is having the understanding that you can see the world in a much broader perspective than you could. And some of that gets into talking about what's the purpose of the memoir. And I'm going to cycle back to that eventually. But there is some value in talking about that. So we will get back to that. So certainly if people are working on writing fiction and they're thinking about point of view in fiction, it's the same thing. Is you need to decide what lens you're going to tell the story through. And I've seen it described as a camera lens. So if you were a director and this was a film, what are we seeing on the screen and how are we interpreting that as then coming through the camera lens? So that's the choice of point of view. And I think one of the most valuable things to do in any book that you're reading to understand from a craft perspective versus just reading to enjoy a book is thinking about what are the choices that author has made and why have they chosen to do it that way. That's why I think it's really useful to choose to read books that are similar to what it is that you want to write. And I know some people worry like, oh, I'm going to soak up that voice or I'm going to be too much of that. Don't worry about that at this point. At this point, look at how did they choose to do that. So if you read something like the Glass Cow, David Sedaris, which would be, you know, it is sort of a memoir and it's sort of a short essay piece. So that can be an interesting way of looking at that. So that may be something that's beneficial. So one of your second questions was, should you throw in other characters like the mother and the grandmother? So again, my first question is always why? What does that bring to your story? What do you feel that you gain from that? And then conversely, what is it that's going to make that then more challenging about doing it in that particular way? So are you writing a memoir or are you writing creative nonfiction? And that's another choice that you get to make. And so if you're truly in the point of view of the mother and grandmother, then it becomes creative nonfiction. I think you can still stay to memoir if what you do is set up to the reader of, for this next bit, I am putting myself in the shoes of my mother, and I am writing what I think my mother was thinking, so that you're very clear to some degree that there is a distance in this point of view. This is not truly my mother's point of view because you have not asked her, I'm guessing, to write that chapter. Although, again, that's a whole other option if your mother, I don't know about your grandmother certainly, but if they are in fact still around, or if there are letters or diaries where you could in some way insert their point of view. But I'm curious, what was it about them that you wanted to add that for?
First of all, that answered a huge question and that made it perfectly clear. Now, the reason why I was thinking of adding in the mother and the grandmother is because they have two very different view of what went on.
Oh, yeah.
So this will come back up again in the next question that you're probably going to start answering. You know, it's because of the way that the child then starts to spiral a little bit out of control coming into her tweens and teen years. It's the explanation to the story. But I think you just answered it, because I don't need to use their point of view, but I can use their stories.
Yes.
Now, my grandmother is long gone, but we spent a long time talking about the stories when she was still here, which is, you know, a long time ago. And my mother is still around, so I can ask her about details and stuff like that. So,
and you could even ask your mother to respond, you know, in a written form to some very specific questions, or, whether you're recording her as well, where you're having some things to sort of truly have a piece of her point of view in that story.
Yeah.
But I do think, there's an interesting balance by showing that.
Yes. Okay.
I think this is one of the more interesting things. And I worked with another student that was struggling through a memoir for a long period of time, and actually ended up making it a fictionalized version.
Yes.
And part of that was, it was an individual dealing with a mother who had mental illness. So a lot of her childhood was quite confusing, because her mother had untreated, undiagnosed schizophrenia, and was, parenting from not a great place, and therefore making her childhood very confusing to her. And then her mother, unfortunately, committed suicide. And she's still dealing with that. And what she realized when she was trying to write it as a memoir is she didn't have full resolution to those issues, and she didn't have some of the answers she felt she needed to make it a memoir. But if she fictionalized it, she could then take control of the narrative and make some decisions about things that in fact never did happen, but that she wished had happened. So that's always, I think, an interesting way of doing it. So one of your questions was, how do you weave in the best story of self? And that raised for me what I think is the most important question for this, which is, what's the purpose of your memoir? Is it for you and for your family? Is it for a general readership? And if it is for the readership, do you have a target reader? Do you have a thought on that? Like what you're hoping to do with it?
And I do want to publish it when it's done. And I think I at the moment I'm kind of swinging back and forward between, is it a memoir or is it nonfiction? And I think I have so many questions that you don't know. You think you know what a memoir and what nonfiction is until you start working on one of them, and then you go, no, I actually don't know anything about this. So, but yeah, I do like to publish it, and I do struggle with, the truth. The thing to me that is important is that I get to the truth, because from where I started, it was pretty much based on lies and silence. So it's untangling the silence and figuring out what is the truth and what is not the truth. And then as I'm going back, I'm finding out that what I believed was the truth back then doesn't hold truth anymore. So it's a story of truth and opening up that silence that was happening. So yeah. So again, back to the voice and back to finding the voice. So that's what it is about. It's about finding the voice.
Well, I think one of the things that's really important for you to give yourself permission for, which I always find myself having to go back to, is I don't necessarily have to have all of these answers at this point. You don't have to know if this is a memoir or nonfiction at this point. You have to start writing, and you may discover what you have. So when you have, for example, you might want to do almost mirrored scenes. So this is a scene from my childhood or my teen years and what I believed about that scene. And now I'm holding a mirror up to that scene from where I am now, with maybe some information from family members, with, age and wisdom that has come. And this is now how I interpret that scene. And you may just go back and forth with that until you have, a nice tidy collection of stacks of paper. And then you can start thinking, because for me, it often comes down to asking, and I'm of course writing fiction, but it's the same thing, is what's this really about? And what's the purpose of it? And why would someone want to read it?
Yeah.
So if you're writing fiction, for example, obviously the general purpose is usually entertainment. So people are reading it to be entertained. But for me, writing suspense, I'm thinking like, I want people to have that like, what happened? Oh my, what? Your purpose may be to illuminate for someone else who's having that question. So you may discover that you're running to, at the end of chapters, have prompts and questions for people to journal about, that's about their own thing. So you suddenly realize what I'm writing about is to some degree a help manual for other people who are going through this process to discover truth, or at least to filter truth. That's my dog sharing her thoughts on this issue.
Thoughts on it, yes.
Yes. And so you can count on her to have a thought. So I'm going to yell at them. Hang on. So I muted myself to yell at them. And now I'm going to provide them with a dog treat as a bribe. Because I am nothing if not clever. Okay, so if you're working from home, you have to have ways to bribe the dogs. All right. So again, going back, for you, I wouldn't worry about, is this memoir? Is it nonfiction? Do I, in the end, want to fictionalize this all together? And just start writing those scenes. And you may end up writing them out of order. You may, do something. One thing I'd encourage you to do is possibly do a timeline, just so you have a sense. And you can always add to that timeline. But, here's birth, and here's where I am today. And these are the major events that I feel like I really want to place onto that timeline.
Yeah, I have those.
Perfect.
I have a timeline of what happened, and then I have the post-it notes for each of the stories to go in there. Yeah.
And then the big key is writing those, is getting them down on a piece of paper. And then once you have them, the question becomes, and this is I'm putting on my publisher hat for a moment. So I'm imagining that I'm an editor or an agent. And the question is, why do I care? So that is fundamentally, when it comes to publishing, that's a story. And I remember talking to an agent friend of mine, and she was talking about, she had taken a pitch, and it was a woman talking about how she had survived cancer. And so it was a book about her cancer, a memoir about her cancer diagnosis and her treatment through it. And I said, oh, well, what did you think? And she was like, I don't care. She's like, I don't know her. She's not a friend of mine. Unless she has a new spin on it, there are 1,000,001 cancer memoirs. What makes her interesting? How do we sell hers? It's one thing if she's a movie star and she has cancer, then people want to read about it to know, how does, Madonna deal with this crisis? Or she has to have something unique, something in her voice that is laugh out loud funny. Or she has tips and techniques that make me think, oh, this could be used in this way. That can be paralyzing when you're trying to write. It's sort of like asking a fiction writer, what's your theme? And watching them start to sweat. You don't know what that is often until you have enough body of work to sort of evaluate what it's going to look like. But I would write somewhere a little question to yourself to cycle back to, which is, why does anyone care? Yes. What is it about this memoir that adds value to something? So, for example, a memoir like Eat, Pray, Love, whether you liked it or not, and people have different feelings about that memoir, but was sort of a particular journey, actual physical journey, and talking about, what that was like and what that looked like, and an entertainment value, but also trying to set up for women going through a similar kind of process. How could I move forward in my life? So thinking about what's going to be the purpose of that. So I found your next question fascinating, and I want to talk about it. As you said, how do you find and formulate the truth while creating characters that are fundamentally decent? And my question is, why do they need to be fundamentally decent?
It's a quote from, forgotten his name. Stephen King. It's one of King's quotes. And he's talking about making, and he's writing about terrible characters, characters who comes out of the ground, and but he's the one who says make them fundamentally decent, and that rings a chord with me. Also in relation to reading, the Glass Castle and Mary Carr's memoirs, that the people, there is no poor me, because that's just so cringeworthy. There's no poor me. Everybody is, there's nobody stabbing anybody. There's no, they just, even in their horror, they're fundamentally decent. Maybe not Carr's grandmother. I can't see much decency in her, but
okay.
But so that's where the question is coming from. And it's so easy, I think, when you write a memoir where you can see that, if these people had had some help and if they had had a little bit more knowledge, then things would have turned out a lot differently. And that's hindsight. So you still want to make them decent, even though they were alcoholics. They made stupid choices and it all went wrong. But you still want to get some sense of decency from them, in my opinion. Yeah.
Fair enough. And I'm going to, I put in the chat window, and I will put, when I post the office hours, a link to an article that I found really interesting, which was around truth in memoir, and was around a person talking about, she was writing about an abusive husband. And in her early drafts of that memoir, he is awful. And in later drafts of that memoir, she is kinder to him and harder on herself. So she finds some degree of objectivity that comes through that. So part of it for me is thinking about, and whether or not this is fictional characters or characters in a memoir, is that anyone who is the bad guy does not know that they are the bad guy. Right? From their perspective, they have a story to tell, and they have reasons for doing what they're doing, reasons/excuses. And a lot of us don't necessarily have a lot of insight in the moment. So taking some time, I think, if you want to understand those people, and almost maybe doing a journal entry as if you were that person, and asking yourself, what is it that I want? What is it that I feel I'm not getting? How do I see that situation? So I come from a counseling background. So I worked as a counselor for 20 plus years. And one of the things I remember most distinctly about graduate school was a particular counseling theory called rational emotive therapy, of which there is no quiz, don't worry. But rational emotive therapy is based on the idea of what he would sort of call ABC. So A was the activating event. That's what actually happened. B was our belief about that event. And C was the consequence of that belief. So for example, if the activating event is you walk into a room, everyone in the room is laughing. When they see you walk in, they stop laughing. That's the event. That's what actually happens. If your belief about that event is they're all laughing at me, then the consequence might be that you curse them out and storm out of the room. Or the consequence is that you limit your interaction with those people, or you become more shy. And that has now actually impacted reality, because the truth is your belief may be completely wrong.
Yeah.
The truth may be they were laughing and it just happened to come to an end when you came into the room. Or someone had said, okay, when Vig gets here, it's going to be time to get down to business. And, that's where it is because we need to get going. And so that was just their cue, like it's time to get back on track. But now you're going to be reacting to them differently, and that then alters reality. Using a teen example, if a teen comes downstairs and she's taken time to get dressed, she's going out with friends, and the mother says, are you going to wear that? And the teen believes, you think I look like a slut, or you think I don't look good, or you never approve of me, she's going to have a consequence of how she reacts to that and how she feels about that. Where again, the truth may be the mom is simply thinking it's a lot colder out than that tank top warrants, or I thought that was in the wash, or you asked me earlier about your purple sweater, so I don't know why you're now wearing that. But that relationship has impacts. So I think in a memoir, it can be interesting to go back and ask yourself, what is it that happened? And what were the people in that room's belief about those things?
Yes.
And then how did that then alter and change things? So, you talked initially about how do you discover the truth? And that, I think, is one of life's great mysteries because truth is always filtered through our experience. And that's why I think when we get older and we've had more experience, we have the realization of, oh, that wasn't quite the way I thought it was. Now I have enough experience to see this other thing. And for you as the writer, it's the choice of how much of the real truth do I want the reader to see at any point? Do I want them to have the same belief structure that I had in that moment and then suddenly turn that on its head? So I'm going to use a fictional example. So this is one of the most cliched things that you see in romantic comedies. But the heroine realizes that she loves this guy. She's going to tell him, I love him. She runs downstairs to declare her love, and she sees him with his arms around another woman. And she's devastated. Clearly, he's seeing someone else. And so now she's not going to admit that she cared at all. And their next interaction, she's very cool, very professional. Everything's at a distance. And things are growing further and further apart. Sudden resolution. This turns out that it's his sister-in-law, and he had been giving her a hug because something had happened. And he's actually been in love with her too, and he doesn't know why. And so part of the fun of the romantic comedy is often that the viewer or the reader knows both sides. So we're desperately doing the like, he loves you, like you just have to believe. Whereas in mystery, which, in thrillers where I'm writing, I want the reader to see something, but I want them to have the same belief structure that my main character has, which may not be accurate. So that's the moment when you suddenly look back at a clue and you say, we all saw the clue thinking it meant that it was Miss Scarlet in the library with the wrench. And now that I realize it was Miss Scarlet carrying the wrench away for this other person, because now I have a much bigger understanding of what was going on. So again, when we kind of go back to you thinking about what point of view do I want to have, part of that is how much do you want the reader to know at any given time versus how much do you want them to discover?
That is so good. I'm just like, wow. I've been reading and studying and writing and finding things out. And why haven't anybody put it like that before? That was now again.
Oh, I'm so glad that that's helpful.
A book about writing.
I should write a book about writing by art. But yes. I do think one of the things that I really grew into understanding the more that I wrote was understanding that I was making all sorts of choices. So when do I start a story? What things do I include? What character's point of view am I taking? How long does a scene go on? What information, again, does the reader have both perspectives or only one perspective? And the more that I did that, the more I understood, because I didn't think of them really as choices. I was just writing the story. But then I realized how much control you actually have. And that kind of gets back to that initial question is, what am I trying to accomplish? Am I trying to have a sense of suspense where people are oh, I wonder if it's this or if it's that, or am I trying to set up that sense that you often have in romance or romantic comedies where the person is like, no, you're not looking right. And you're cheering for these two people to get together. And you're like, if only they would have this conversation, they would realize they love each other. It's his sister-in-law, damn it. It's his sister-in-law. And that's part of the pleasure of those stories, is to be the knowledgeable one ahead of the character. But those, again, are all choices. Around that question of making people fundamentally decent, I think we're talking about the same thing. But I initially took your question, which is sometimes a memoir thing, around not wanting to be mean to people that are in your life. Or feeling, one of the challenges with memoir is this may be my mother, or this may be my brother or uncle, and I don't want to hurt someone. And I don't know if that to some ways can be avoided, because you're going to be telling your truth, and that truth may be hurtful to people, and people may have behaved in a way that was not fundamentally decent at that time.
Including the protagonists.
Including the protagonist. Unfortunately, you're not off the list.
Unfortunately, you're not off the list, not at all.
Yes. So it's about giving yourself that permission to see the ugly bits. Mm-hmm. In fiction, sometimes it's really challenging for people to be mean to their characters because we start to like them. And so when I'm talking to people, I'm like, you're going too easy. You're letting her off the hook. But I think it holds in memoir as well, which is drilling down and letting maybe the ugly bits be there, but you're showing the motivation, which is ugly without motivation is sort of evil. That's true sociopathic kind of stuff. And that's a whole separate issue that you're dealing with. But we often hurt people that we tremendously love because we don't have the skills to do what's right, or we don't have the right information to do what's right. But if as a reader, I know, and again, I'm giving the romantic comedy example to make it a lighter example, but if I show that the main character has been hurt multiple times and rejected multiple times, I see that she's going to shove this guy out without letting him get close, not because that's the right decision or the fundamentally decent decision, but because she is wounded and she is coping with that wound in the best way that she can in that moment. And I understand her motivation for behavior that may be poor, even if I don't agree with it. It's similar to, and not to infantilize adult people, but if you're ever with small children and you see a toddler that has a breakdown and you have a parent that knows like they're losing it and they're behaving badly, but it's because they didn't get their nap and their lunch. And so I'm not going to take it personal when they say, I hate you, you're a horrible mommy. It still may hurt me, but I understand where it's coming from. To some degree, you're giving that power to the reader. So the reader knows the motivation for the character's actions. Yeah. So again, my thing is, it's okay if people are not fundamentally decent, as long as they're fundamentally motivated. There's a reason for what they do.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the motivation.
It's the motivation. And again, in the moment, we often don't understand it. So for women, often we struggle in romantic relationships with men because men often are not as well versed in dealing with emotion, because as small children, they're taught that it's good not to, versus young women are often taught to talk about emotion and to, you hurt me. Whereas boys are told, don't cry and those kinds of things. So then as adults, when we're trying to interact with them like grownups, there are times where you might have a man who will just pull away or shut down.
Yeah.
And it leaves the woman feeling more isolated and alone, and in fact more hurt, because she doesn't understand necessarily the motivation. But sometimes you do get that. So that was for me, when you asked about that, treating characters fairly is first and foremost, tell your story, get it down on the page. You can always go back and revise that. And the link to the article that I included really talked about, for her, was the realization that although she was writing a memoir and about abusive husband, and for which there is no excuse for that abuse, that to have a story that's just, he's an awful person, look what an awful thing he did to me, gains nothing. But to understand the tender bits of him, the parts of him that attracted her when they started dating, understanding why she chose to stay, understanding in her own self, where did I fall down and let myself down?
Yes.
Is what actually made that memoir not a revenge piece, not an unburdening to, a friend, but a true, useful piece of information.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I can see that it could go in a different way where I don't want to go, but.
And you may not want to go there. There may be times where you find it's uncomfortable. And in fact, oftentimes, again, reverting back to my counselor hat, that's what I would be looking for as a counselor. If we were discussing an issue and I saw you pull back in your chair or cross your arms or look away from me, I would think, I'm onto something here. And I would try and dance my way back to it.
Yeah, no, I don't want to shy away from the hard parts. What I don't particularly want to walk into is the, hey, let me show you how I did it. And, I just find that there are so many of those books out there at the moment. And I'm going like, no, I don't want to get up on a high horse and tell people how to live their life. That's not. This is a book, read the book. If you get anything out of it, it's fine. But, I'm not here to teach. I'm just here to tell a story.
And that is fundamentally the biggest choices that you're making, which is the purpose of this memoir. Like what I'm hearing you say is you've already decided this is not a memoir that is about, here's what you should be doing. This is a memoir about sharing my particular story in a way. And again, I haven't read a single page of your memoir, so I have no idea, is it funny? Like there are people who write about extremely painful topics that are extraordinarily funny. It can be just strictly entertaining, like, oh my God, that's so different from any worldview that I've ever had. But it's often a balance of some of those things. And it's, something that people, so I hear you saying, I'm writing a memoir that for some degree is about enjoyment. It's about hopefully enjoying the story that I'm telling, and that you may walk away with some things that make you think at the end of it.
Yeah, that's it. That's it. You probably want really, not everybody is going to enjoy it, I don't think, because it's, it's tough stuff. But yeah, to spin it in a light and to balance that whole, something horrible is about to happen. So let's try and write it in a way that you can get through it, that you want to continue to read it. And not just skip all the little bits that are helping it to make it funny, or to see the characters, their struggle in a silly way, or to get through to the other side. Otherwise you're going to stop reading and you're just going to go, no, I can't handle this. Yeah.
Well, and I think that's true. I think, and that's can be a challenge with memoir, is sometimes people are writing about very painful topics. And the question is, does someone want to read about a painful topic? And I think people do, but it is a balance, and it's finding that balance where parts are painful, but there are parts that are uplifting, or parts that are humorous, or parts that make us see, into our own sort of infallibility and, oh my God, I do that same thing on a much different scale. And that can be really useful.
Yes.
So for me, kind of looking over your questions and, sort of prepping for today is, my advice to you going forward would be, you're already reading, it sounds like, tons of memoirs, but, pulling some of your favorites off the shelf, or if there's anywhere, if when it came time to sell your memoir, you would say, this is a memoir similar to A, B, and C. And then look at what the structure is with that. The most valuable thing that you can do is just keep writing. The biggest advice is you can't ever fix a blank page. So make sure you're just moving forward and don't get too down on yourself. And you can always fix it. You can always rewrite it. You can always do it a different way. But just getting those stories down will be huge. And then thinking about motivation. So thinking about what's the motivation behind what different characters are doing. What was it that they were trying to do? So I remember as a counselor, one of the things that, I had to wrap my head around was people act in what they perceive to be their best interest. Yeah. Even if they're doing something that is completely the wrong decision. So for example, someone who is coping with stress by drinking heavily to the point of intoxication, they're doing it because they truly believe this is the way they're going to get through this evening. And they don't have another way to do that. So it's understanding that it was a choice. There was a motivation behind doing it, not like, I'm going to make this situation worse by drinking. They're not usually trying to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's one of the themes.
Yeah. People act in what, again, they perceive to be their best interest. So, but they're not right about that. But if we understand that they truly believe that, that gives us some insight to where they go. So does that give you some places to start next?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And this is brilliant. This is fantastic. Thank you so much.
I love when people say brilliant.
It is brilliant.
It's such a Britishy kind of thing to say. Something's brilliant.
Is it? Okay, well, we are Europeans. We're supposed to be brilliant.
You do brilliant and lovely. All right. Yes. Well, keep writing. I will be back here in the morning, your evening, 2 weeks from today. So please feel free to come and send me an update or send me a message on River and let me know if those exercises are helpful or not helpful. And we'll tackle the next thing.
Yes, fantastic.
Yeah. Thank you so much. You're welcome. Have a lovely evening.
Yes, I'm ready for bed soon. So
I don't blame you. I'm ready for bed and it's only 10 a.m. So all right. Have a good day.
Thank you so much.
Take care. Bye-bye.